Hello, hello, and thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I'm so excited to be chatting with Shane Koller, Chief People Officer at Ancestry. Shane has a really cool story leading people teams and companies, both in the high-tech industry, healthcare companies. He's worked at Domo, Adobe. He's also led companies through various stages of growth. So today I want to dig into metrics and data, which Shane has so much knowledge about. So I'm excited to get into it. Shane, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Rasika. I'm excited to do the podcast.
Excited to dig in. I love it. I love it. There are so many possible HR metrics to track. Sometimes it makes my head spin. You can look at engagement, retention, productivity, DEI related metrics. The list truly goes on. And so really to start, I'm curious how you prioritize which ones matter the most for driving business impact.
It's a great question. And honestly, I think the HR function is finally at a stage now where we actually have data and we have good data. The problem also sometimes is that we have so much data. And so I love your question because really what ends up happening in a lot of the teams that I've been a part of is we fall in love with our data and we're like tracking everything. And what ends up happening is we have a lot of noise, maybe not so much signal. So for me, one of the things that I learned in a previous company was that you have to be really disciplined around the things that you believe matter most. And so what I look at most often is the proximity of the metric to the business impact. So of all the metrics that I track, which ones seem to have the most horsepower? And what I mean by that is which of the metrics tend to run in parallel to what I'm hearing our best people talk about? And I know this sounds like a little anti-data, but I think the data are really good to be used in connection with what you hear your best people talking about on a regular basis. What are they concerned about? What do I hear them mention without actually saying the name of a metric? I'll give you an example. At Ancestry in particular, one of the most impactful metrics we have is a score in our engagement track called purpose. And the gist of the question is, or the statement, I guess it is, that the work I do has meaning to me. Mm-hmm. And what we've noticed over the years is that even in times that are difficult, when the business is soft or we're going through a lot of change, what our best people are saying is, I love the work I do. It has meaning. It has an impact. And as long as I don't hear that start to fade, or if I start to see that metric shifting, I know that we've got something really wrong. Mm-hmm. And the purpose score for me is one of my true north metrics. There are a bunch of others, but that's just a quick example of pairing data with the things that you hear your people say. That to me is a really powerful combination.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I think there's a phrase, perception is reality. And I think that marries those two things together. If you're hearing things and people are raising certain topics, you're often going to see that in the data that you gather. And I think the way that you were able to hone in on purpose being really cornerstone to your culture and how it drives results. Every company has that unique measurement where they're like, okay, every single time I see this score go up or this score go down, there's an outcome on the other end that's meaningful. Mm-hmm. And discovering that for yourself, it may not be the same thing for every organization, but purpose, I think, is a valuable metric for any organization to track, and to see that it's had such an impact on your business is really cool to hear. And so for me, I also feel like aligning those metrics to the business's current goals is also interesting. Businesses, sometimes you can't always juice growth. You can't always, sometimes it's hard. You have to focus on growth, or you have to focus on profitability. Like you're optimizing for a certain thing at a certain time. And so for me, if the focus is on growth, I'm thinking about retention. I'm thinking about time to hire. If we're thinking about innovation or transformation, I might be thinking about something different. And so I'm curious how you've thought about metrics as it relates to the current state of your business.
Yeah, I think you framed it really well. There are seasons within any business. And one in particular that I'll call out, there was a period of time where we were really focused on cost containment. And what we had seen was that our personnel costs were growing at a faster clip than revenue was. Mm-hmm. And so for me and for my team, we then became very intrigued about what all of the inputs were to our personnel costs. And for us in those moments, we then recognize that ensuring that we were creating a good connection between the value that we provide to our employees in the form of different benefits or whatever it might be was in line with what we expected. And all of those things put together, did we feel like we had a really good value proposition for the moment, knowing that we needed to probably cost contain a little bit, right? I think you're absolutely right, though. In seasons of high growth, it's really about, in my mind, like in those moments, for us, one of the best things that we can do is understand which particular roles, which particular teams have a disproportionate impact on the growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you a more specific example. There was a period of time where we were in the middle of a pretty major product transformation. And what we recognized after we were digging into our own data was that we had a leaky bucket in a couple of our more critical teams. Teams like data science, product analytics, right? We were losing people at a much faster clip than we had expected.
Mm-hmm.
And those were also the teams that were responsible for ensuring that all of the product work that we were doing, that we could translate that to really good testing in the market, right? To see if this product work was actually resonating, if it was driving revenue. And so in that moment for us, we recognized that our ability to not only bring talent in the door, but bring the right talent in that wouldn't churn on too quick a basis. That was a moment where my team could see a pre and post, and we found that we not only plugged the holes in the leaky bucket, but we actually were able to bring talent in that then stayed for a much longer period of time, and therefore could impact all of these product related changes. And we could see the impact flow through to better testing, better reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And while those things in and of themselves are minor players, they made the difference between us understanding whether or not we should keep a certain product test in the market or should we pull it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a wonderful moment for my team to be able to see that something that we honed in on that could have been buried in a rosier picture around attrition, we were able to hone in on that and then essentially get to action pretty quickly, and I think close the gap that we had.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example where it's not always just about these blanket metrics around engagement and retention. Like you're specifically focused on what are some of the key work streams that are happening right now and what can I discover in what's going on within those teams to increase their potential, increase their impact, and ultimately impact the bottom line. And so that's a good segue to another topic I wanted to discuss, which is just around employee engagement metrics in general. ENPS, this is a North Star for a lot of people teams. It helps you baseline your company culture with others, but it's tough, especially in a wartime environment. It can sometimes feel disconnected to business results. Companies have had to do layoffs, restructuring, and they have to make these tough calls for the business. And of course, engagement and some of these ENPS like metrics are affected. And so I'm curious how you connect people metrics around engagement to broader business goals, or perhaps there's an example you can share as you think about your learnings there.
Yeah, I think some of this comes down to what kind of environment you're in and what level of data maturity your leadership team has.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some companies I've been a part of that really struggle to understand the connection at all between engagement and productivity or revenue growth, right, or business results. And then there are other environments where people really do understand because they've experienced it over years and decades when they've had highly engaged teams versus times where they've had challenges. So I would say currently at Ancestry, I'm really fortunate that the leadership team, very broadly speaking, has great maturity around engagement data. So when we talk about things like ENPS, ESAT, purpose, psychological safety, right? Like there's good uptake on those metrics. So I think we have created the credibility within my team and my org that when we talk about some of these measures, there's really good literacy is the better way to put it. There's really good literacy around those concepts. So I haven't found in this environment a real struggle in helping leaders to feel like there is a good connection. I also, just as an aside, we have a fantastic internal, we call them people partners. We have a fantastic people partner team, very senior, like trusted advisor types. And so our leadership team has had years and years of these advisors being a part of their conversations so they can say, for example, just to give you a more specific example, if we've got a team that has very low psychological safety, that advisor team is able to then connect the dots to say, all right, look, your scores are in a really challenging place when it comes to psychological safety. Here's what that looks like. Here are any additional data cuts that we might provide. For example, you have really low psychological safety in employees who have been here for 4 to 5 years, but it actually moderates and attenuates as people get further down their tenure. And then they can look at what's happening in the team. As an example, if we have teams that are saying we are not collaborating well and so we've missed deadlines, or we've actually made mistakes when it comes to whether it's a product launch or a marketing campaign. And so without calling out maybe just one in particular, what I would say is that having advisors in place that really understand those metrics
Mm-hmm.
and understand in a wartime environment that you can connect those dots if you just look for the behaviors that are happening, and either the mistakes that are happening, or in a very positive environment, things are going really smoothly, teams are working well together. That's, I think, oftentimes the missing piece that happens when it comes to engagement is we rely on the data to do all the heavy lifting,
Mm-hmm.
when in fact you oftentimes need a good human being there as a consultant to say, okay, let's talk about this score versus what we're seeing in the team, and helping leaders to connect those dots.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that storytelling element that you are
Mm,
alluding to, which is the data is the data, but really the power in that is to think about what you're seeing, match it with what you're hearing, and building that narrative around it. I think that's what is really going to engage your stakeholders and ultimately enable them to be the champions of change as you think about the things that you want to implement. This is actually reminds me of a time where a number of years ago, as the company Salsify and our founders were very into data, but they found that a lot of times people just cast a chart. It was unclear. What are you saying? What are you trying
yeah.
to communicate? And so we created this program called Data Skeptics, where they would lead every month. You could apply, or every quarter, and they'd choose a number of folks in the organization, and they'd run a course around how to really build these compelling narratives with the data
Oh
that
yeah.
you provide. And that was the unlock. It's like you could have all the data in the world, but if you're not able to craft a story, nobody's going to pay attention to it. So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I think and then really testing the narrative with your stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think too often we hold a lot of the HR metrics close to the vest, and we're the experts. We're going to tell you what these metrics mean. I think the storytelling piece gives you an opportunity to say, does that actually make sense? Tell me what you're seeing within your team, and let's see if we can diagnose and connect those dots. But if you're challenging the metric, that could lead to a great conversation about either we haven't cut this enough ways to really understand the insight,
Mm-hmm.
or there is something else going on here that we need to investigate. But I think pulling your stakeholders into that narrative and helping them to co-create the narrative
Mm-hmm.
becomes a lot more powerful, because then, like you say, then your leaders take those metrics on as their own,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
versus it feeling like this is a team trying to tell them what their data is and what it's not.
Totally, totally. Yeah, you always want them to be just a part of the process as you are and feel like they have a sense of ownership in it. So, love that. You talked about productivity, and this is a hot topic these days, especially
Mm.
in the remote, now becoming hybrid, becoming in person environment. Everybody wants to measure impact. And in a world where the macro environment's tough, the entire business may be suffering, it's hard to tell whether it's the employee that maybe is not as productive as they could be, or the circumstances of the world in which they're in. And so, how do you effectively measure employee productivity while also controlling for all of these external macro factors?
That's a fantastic question and a very relevant question. Ancestry has a hybrid work environment. So we have a combination of come into the office in the moments that matter, but be where you need to be for the rest of the time. Our people absolutely love that. But one of the ongoing themes and questions is, do we know whether or not our people are productive in that kind of environment? And there's a temptation, I will say, and we've fallen victim to it, there's a temptation to want to try to build all these new productivity measures, right? Like revenue per employee and EBITDA per employee and all of these different things. And I think what that misses, at least for us, what it missed when we did it was that we had a whole bunch of data points, but it didn't necessarily answer the question, right? Like we could look at code committed, we could look at bug fixes, all of the things. But when we stepped back from all that data, we were like, yeah, but would we say as a result then that our people are really productive? And so what we did after we fell victim to that productivity trap is we pulled back a couple of steps and we asked ourselves as a leadership team, we asked ourselves two questions. One, are we setting aggressive targets for the work we do? Mm. And by aggressive, deadlines, scope of the projects, the work that we're doing, like, do we feel like this is aggressive? Do we feel like we are stretching ourselves, stretching our teams? What anecdotal data are we getting to suggest one way or the other? And then two, how are we doing against those aggressive targets? How often do we find ourselves saying, we need to push this, we need to push this, we didn't hit this, we made mistakes? And for us, recognizing that so much of the macro is out of our control, and just as an aside, like it's also very tempting to say, the economy is just really tough right now. And the danger in doing that, and every company falls prey to this to some degree or another, the danger in that is that people go, we'll pick this up again when the economy improves. Mm-hmm. That is not viable, right? The company has to continue to run. And so what we do specifically at Ancestry is focus on execution. We have town halls on a regular basis. One of the common refrains in the town hall is, hey, regardless of what's happening on the macro level, and that could be X, Y, and Z, we need to focus on execution. And this is what it looks like for this upcoming quarter, right? Mm-hmm. We have these big launches, we have these big campaigns. And so execution for us is ensuring that we hit this deadline, that this campaign goes well, and we've got all the success metrics for those, right? So we've actually stepped back from the temptation to measure every form of productivity, and we've taken a higher order view of it to say, are we aggressive enough? Are we stretchy enough? And then how are we doing against that? And that for us has become, I would say, a good proxy for productivity. And that's really, I would say, the best answer we have for it to this point.
Yeah. That's meaningful. Yeah. Productivity, it's one of those things where on the surface, it sounds really easy to measure. There, we know what the work is. And if people are doing the work, then I assume we're productive, but it's actually so much more layered and so much more complicated than that. And so I think the way that you've been able to unpack that and at Ancestry is a really good lesson for others thinking about the same notions. I'm sure
it's a tough one.
It's a tough one. Among productivity, what are some of the other more difficult people metrics that you have to explain to non-HR execs or board members? How do you package and communicate people data in a way that resonates with those focused on business outcomes? Are there themes that you see are top of mind for the board members that you're talking to? What comes to mind? What's hot in the space now?
Yeah, I would say the ones that we typically have a little bit more of a challenge with are the metrics that feel more psychological in nature. So I'll give you a few examples, right? Like I think psychological safety is one, even engagement, especially to board members that are not as close to the day-to-day work that we do. When we say our ESAT is 75, without any additional context, they're sort of like, okay, I guess. So for us, that's we take our storytelling even to our board, and we've had great conversations. About a year ago, I did a deep dive with our board on kind of the state of talent and what are the big things that we're facing, what keeps me up at night, how are we doing against all of our people goals, and so we had to do a lot of storytelling. We had to kind of start from the beginning to say, when we're talking about engagement in a hybrid environment, what do we actually mean? And so in those cases, I think we've had to sort of back up a little bit and provide a little bit more of the context. Whereas I would say like a metric like quality of hire seems to resonate a little bit more naturally, because if we can say, hey, this is a combination of new hire and manager score, and here are the questions, here's how we measure it at 30 days, at 90 days, that tends to resonate a little bit more. We've definitely had to lean into our storytelling when it comes to the more, I would say, psychologically based metrics that we track.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For me, I feel like learning and development, the impact of those programs can always be tricky. It's always hard to make that. It's very similar to impact of hire. It's hard to make the one-to-one connection, similar to the psych safety stuff. I try to, with those cases, tie one metric to another if I can. That is
Hmm.
a little bit easier. So for us, a lot of our learning and development programs, they reinforce a lot of the core values that we have internally, and sometimes it's easy to measure those values questions through the surveys that you put out. So yeah, in some ways it feels like a roundabout way of measuring that one thing, but it's still hard. It's not necessarily direct. And there are also, I mean, when you think of the marketing world, there's brand, right? That's always so hard.
Oh
Investments in
yeah.
brand. I mean, like that can sometimes take years to see the fruits of those investments. So it's a lot of these like long term bets that I find hard to back up with data in the short term.
Yeah, and I do think, just playing on something that you said, one of the more, I think, successful efforts we've had is when we have been able to connect multiple data points together to kind of tell that story. So, for example, if we're talking about high performers, being able to look at that from kind of the employee lifecycle perspective. So, how did those individuals come on board? What was the quality of higher score? What do we see their engagement plus the number of months since they had their last promotion or their last development exercise, and what are those things sort of in combination? What are we seeing for our high performers versus those who are struggling? And really being able to put, like, I would say, combinations of measures together to kind of plot those, to say, you would, for example, think that all of those measures should be very distinct and different between your high performers and your low. But if you can't tell that story,
Mm-hmm.
or if things are kind of munged in the middle and you're like, not a lot of differentiation there, that's actually concerning. And so, one of the things that I would just say that has been um, a greater insight to me over the years than others is the idea of getting beneath the surface of aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
When you can actually say, okay, instead of just saying, for example, high performer and low, if we look at it from like a 9 box perspective, and we
Mm-hmm.
can get more granular, and we can say those people who are super high potential and super high performance, do we see significant differentiation in those metrics from someone who is kind of more of a core performer?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then being able to kind of share that story visually, that to me is when the board really lights up, because then they can see that all these concepts that we talk about, like differentiation,
Mm-hmm.
they can actually see them in action, and the result is greater retention for the one group than the other over time. Okay, that makes a difference, right? But just one in isolation may not have as much utility as multiple measures together predicting retention or predicting performance over
Yep.
time.
Yep. Totally. Yeah. I think it also allows you to be true to yourself. At a past company, we oftentimes we are one of our core values was taking risks and being innovative. And, I noticed the people that got promoted, they were often the ones that took the safe route. And,
Mm-hmm.
the risks sometimes got penalized. And so we had a conversation around like your culture is who you hire, fire, and promote, right? Like if you're promoting the people that are not, taking the risks and are not necessarily being innovative, like our culture is actually not that. And so I think when you
Yeah.
look at those examples in the 9 box, you're actually able to say, who is successful at this company, like what is our culture and what types of traits do have an impact here, what do we want to look for. So I think that's a really good story.
Yeah, and trying to quantify some of these more qualitative measures, right? So at a previous company, we found kind of similarly that the people we were promoting were the people who appeared to be busy all the time
Mm-hmm.
and would respond to emails super late at night or on the weekends.
Mm-hmm.
But when we dissected that a little bit more, it wasn't that they were necessarily better performers. They just tended to be performative in the work they did,
Right.
and so we were able to then kind of hold the mirror up and say, this really who we want to be promoting? Because let's look at the last 5 promotions, very senior level promotions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a common thread here, and it allows you to kind of test your culture. And to your point, I mean, culture is oftentimes like what you tolerate and what you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those moments, being able to really kind of quantify some of that cultural fuzziness that exists, you can then hold the mirror up and say, is this what we want to see?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally, totally. Well, once you've gathered all this data, how do you ensure that it leads to meaningful action in the organization? Like, how do you approach sharing it back to employees, especially in a world, you hear about data transparency. Some companies are sharing all salaries. Some companies are sharing,
Mm.
every metric everywhere. So what's your process for, sharing back insights and turning them into strategic initiatives?
Yeah, so we have what I would say is a growing process around that at Ancestry. We do what I would call kind of a hierarchical cascade, and importantly, we don't edit materials from one level to the next.
Mm,
So transparency around the data is pretty critical to Ancestry. And so what a VP sees is what a manager sees is what an employee sees. And so we have a number of kind of cascading circles that we use. We start with our VP group, kind of our senior most leaders. We then have another forum shortly after that to cascade it to a broader group. So there's some repetition in that, right? Our VPs are in that broader circle of, call it director plus employees. And then we produce materials that we say, all right, after this last kind of broadest circle share out, here are the materials that we want you to share with your teams. And we provide a little bit of context, a little bit of messaging around that. But effectively, what one group sees is the same as what another group sees. And, at times, our employees who have come from more opaque environments have been skeptical about how much or how little we actually massage the data before we share it.
mm-hmm.
So it's been kind of fun to show like this material that we share with our VPs is exactly the material that we share with our broader management population and that you all see as employees. So we definitely err on the side of sharing as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I agree. I think data can be really empowering if everyone's working with the same amount of information. They have the same pool of they have the same info pool basically, so they're able to
Mhm.
have much stronger insights, maybe much stronger instincts when it comes to potential solutions. I think a mistake I've made in the past is. And this was more so just on the like as a company we were sharing like financial information. I think a mistake that
Mm.
I've seen in the past is sharing more than your employee base can handle at a given time. So it's not to say you
True.
shouldn't share that information, but if people were maybe unfamiliar with that
Mhm.
particular data that you are sharing, I felt like the value was not there because it just, there was no engagement with it. And so I try to think about like, what can my group handle at a given time? And I think the way you've
Mm.
cascaded it is a really nice way of sort of slowly rolling it out in your organization in phases so that you don't jump the gun too much.
Yeah. Well, because then what happens inevitably is that when we share with our VPs, there are insights that they bring that allow us to then think more deeply about the data or play that data through.
Mm-hmm.
We have, for example, marketing leaders who are able to look at the data and say, yes, this is true. Let me give you a little bit more context about why this happened or what we're doing to then correct a trend that's
Mm-hmm.
going in a concerning direction. So the beautiful thing about the cascade, and this is nothing like we haven't reinvented the wheel on this, but being able to digest it with certain populations and then broaden that circle out
Mm-hmm.
allows us to have, I would say, an increasingly clearer narrative as we get further out to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, one of the things that Ancestry does that is relatively early stages. We sort of piloted it with our leadership, kind of our management group earlier in the year. Was we did what we called know the business,
Mm.
and it was an in-person session, and then we also did some materials on the side where we wanted every single leader to understand the core business metrics, the core business terms that we rely on, that way, when, to your point, when we report out certain financial information, they understand the difference between, for example, a GSA and a net sub,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we use these terms all the time,
Sure.
and we found that some of our leaders and our managers didn't understand the difference. So we actually took a step back and said, we're going to provide enough foundational knowledge to where when we use these terms, you understand it as now a business leader, not just a functional leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I
I
think
think
that's
that's so
helped as
key.
well.
Totally, totally. I think in your organization, if everyone can't tell you how do you make money,
Mhm.
what are the top reasons why your customers are engaging with you or leaving you, what are your market competitors doing, and how are you responding to what's happening in the market, I think everyone should be able to answer those questions. And I think your sort of ongoing data sharing then becomes so much more relevant, so much more contextual when you have that foundation built early on. So I think that's
Yeah,
great.
and just to keep it very, very focused on the business results, what we've found is that as we've educated our management team, we've recognized, we've seen a real change in the types of questions that are being asked.
Mm,
So whereas in the past, someone might have had a very generic question about revenue, and if this is happening, why don't we see better revenue results? And now, as they've started to understand that not every dollar is equal
hmm
in the products and services that we offer, now we're getting much more detailed questions about, okay, so if this product provides a lifetime revenue figure of this versus this other one, why are we continuing to push this? Why have we not de-emphasized this and pushed this further? So people are starting to lean in a little bit more as I would say, like business owners, as
hmm
opposed to passive receptors of information.
Yeah,
So that's been really powerful to see.
that's exactly what you want. I think a lot of times people, leadership teams, they see like we're the strategy and then the next level is execution. And so, that isn't necessarily relevant to share all this information. But a lot of the times as an executive, you're not the person in the weeds talking to the customer. You're not the person who's building the product. You're not the person who's kind of experiencing the downsides and upsides of the investments you're making as a business. And so when they
Yeah.
understand these top line metrics and the North Star, you're going to get those insights from the people that are, in the weeds and have exposure to things that you just won't be able to have as an executive. So, empowering your teams through data and that kind of education, I think, is what keeps that wheel as cohesive as you want it to be. So that's
Yeah.
great. Looking ahead, are there, just to wrap, are there any emerging trends or new metrics you think HR leaders should be paying attention to?
This is, I would say, this is actually one of the things that really keeps me excited about this space. Is just really thinking, like, what are we not paying attention to right now that we should be in the future? I would say there are a few that are kind of spinning around in my head at any given time. Ancestry is private equity sponsored, right? So clearly, in a private equity environment, you're always focused on efficiency, being lean, right? And those are good things because it translates directly to business results. I think one of the metrics that my team has been tracking, but will take on more emphasis in the future, is single points of failure,
Mm,
and
hmm
specifically not just the number of single points of failure, but where those single points of failure exist within the organization, and the number of those single points of failure that have mitigation plans attached to them, and how many of those mitigation plans require incremental budgets. So just like double clicking into this concept of points of failure, I think is really critical, because in our environment, especially, if we know that we've got one person doing a particular role, and we know that that role is pretty critical to an upcoming quarter, or to next year's strategy, then we have to be really tight around what kinds of contingencies do we have in place. So kind of providing a little bit more of a heat map around the organization of single points of failure is one.
hmm
Kind of related to that, I would say critical roles. And I don't mean critical people, I mean critical roles. Like,
hmm
really, I would say bringing back the discipline around that. That is not a new metric,
hmm
but I think it's sort of, at least in the companies I've been a part of, it's talked about, but not usually discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And so creating a little bit more discipline around that. Where are those critical roles? Are they the roles that we expect? Do we have good succession planning, quality of talent in the role? All of those things. Those first two kind of go hand in hand to me a little bit. And then honestly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention AI implications,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And so, specifically as it relates to the talent space, I would say we as talent leaders, people leaders, will have more and more responsibility in the coming years
Mm-hmm.
in helping our organizations build a strategy around those implications. How do we think about reskilling, upskilling, identify areas where we should lean into AI and areas where we should lean away from AI? That's where I think the people leader has the potential to be a really impactful voice around the executive table, because we oftentimes hear the feedback deeper in the organization. We understand where there might be opportunities to bring AI into, more of a focus, and then areas where we really shouldn't, where we need greater human touch. And so I think kind of humanizing AI is certainly something that I'm seeing, at Ancestry. We're having great conversations around it, but just not taking the people out of that process, but understanding how we can use AI to reinvest funds into areas where we need that human touch. We need more of it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've been thinking about the exact same things. I think to your earlier point around points of failure, I find a lot of times, especially in fast growing startups, one of the number one reasons that people hold on to an individual who may not be a right fit for the job anymore, or who may be underperforming, is because there's this lack of knowledge transfer. And if I lose this
Mm-hmm.
person, then everything crumbles. And I just think that's such a disservice to both the business and the individual. And so identifying those points of failure early on and making sure the knowledge transfers that you need to have actually happen, holding managers accountable to that stuff, I think is so important for your succession planning. And then to this
Yeah.
AI bit that you mentioned, it reminds me a lot of your productivity insight on hybrid or sort of in person
Mm-hmm.
versus remote. I think with AI too, just like, it's not, as people before were like, okay, if we're in an office, we're going to be productive. If we're not in an office, what are people doing? It's the same thing with AI. If we use AI, we're going to do things faster. If we don't, we won't. And I don't think it's that simple. And so I think really, again, defining what does productivity look like and what are we getting from this resource
Mm-hmm.
versus, this other resource, I think will be really a critical data point for HR folks and organizations to keep their finger on. Yeah.
No question. And one of the things that our CEO, Deb Liu, brought to Ancestry that I've loved is she will constantly ask the question, what does success look like for this?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really changed the nature of conversations that we have, because we know that we should be thinking about, like, what is success from this? So I think to your point around AI, just because we're implementing AI does not mean that suddenly something is going to be better. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, I think the HR space is just ripe with examples of AI, being implemented and things get really terrible, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Recruiting tools that are suddenly sending people updates at the wrong time, or really cold, depersonalized updates.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions that we ask within my team on a pretty regular basis is, how does this impact the employee experience?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can say that any tool, whether it's AI or others, we believe results in better employee experience, we're going to be more likely to lean into it. If we don't have a good use case for it, then I'm going to recommend that we either beta or
Mm-hmm.
that we deprioritize in favor of other things where we feel like there's a stronger use case. So it's really keeping the focus on what success really is going to look like,
Mm-hmm.
and then being really clear about how you know whether or not you're there. That to me has been kind of a guiding principle for us as we've thought about AI in the use, within our team, within the function.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. Well, Shane, I really appreciate you taking time to come on the show. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and everything you've learned along your journey. Until next time.
It was my pleasure, Rasika. Thank you very much for taking the time as well.